Fellow conspiracy realist, we're returning to you with a tale of, with a little bit of synchronicity here. We recently received an excellent piece of correspondence from our fellow conspiracy realist that we'll call Jay. And Jay, you asked us about nuclear experiments in Mississippi. Most people have heard about 3 Mile Island, but what about other nuclear tests on U.S. soil? Now, as we were researching your question here, we were struck by a moment of deja vu. Things seemed very familiar, and lo and behold, we did an entire episode about this debacle back in 2020. Do you guys remember this one? Salt domes?
See, when the U.S. government was doing a lot of experiments, blowing up nuclear weapons, hydrogen bombs, atom bombs, all those things, they tended to do it out in the desert, way in the west of the U.S., But the thing we're going to talk about today is the only place, this area, this thing, also known as the Salmon Test Site, it's the only place east of the Mississippi that the U.S. government has ever detonated a nuclear device.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they did it on purpose. And they did it without repercussions or consequence. It's a real conspiracy. And Jay, your timing is impeccable. We hope you, as well as all our fellow listeners, enjoy this one. So without further ado, let's drop it. Drop it like a bomb. Oh, my God. All right. Yeah.
From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know. A production of iHeartRadio.
Welcome back to the show. My name is Matt. Noel is on adventures.
And we'll be returning soon. They call me Ben. We're joined, as always, with our super producer, Paul Mission Control Tech. And most importantly, you are here, and that makes this stuff they don't want you to know. Matt, I was having a bit of a uncharacteristic wave of nostalgia over this past weekend, and before we went on air, it's weird because it seemed like once again you were reading my mind when you talked about our YouTube channel. It's strange when you think that, we used to do so many videos.
I know that it consumed our lives for several years there, both before and after we got our own channel, which, by the way, is youtube.com/conspiracy stuff. If you haven't checked it out recently, you should go check it out. And we'd actually like for you to run a little test for us. Use your favorite internet search engine, perhaps DuckDuckGo, perhaps Google, Yahoo, whatever, and search for Stuff They Don't Want You to Know YouTube and see what comes up. Because we found, at least on our end, that Google seems to have forgotten about our channel.
Which is, it's kind of flattering to imagine that that channel, which has been inactive for a while, at least up to now, it's kind of flattering to imagine that an entity as large as Google would care about that. To me, that indicates that we were doing something right. Now, granted...
Well... we were either doing something right or, they're categorizing us in the same way as some of these other people who have been taken off of YouTube and other platforms recently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I predict that as things become more unstable in the near to mid future, we're going to see increasingly heavy-handed use of censorship and surveillance powers. But that is to tweak the old figure of speech. That's a bridge we'll burn when we get there. You know what I mean? For now, I've got to say I'm tremendously grateful for every one of our fellow listeners who's been writing to us and telling us about all these strange things that aren't making it into the news. For years and years, you and I have always wanted to cover the things that are just off the edge of the mainstream map. the things that the regions of the map where cartographers of old would draw some serpents and say, "Here be dragons." Things that are just like outside the pool of the streetlight. And we've only been able to do it this long because we have help from the best part of the show, which is specifically you. So what better way to put our money where our mouth is than to explore an episode topic brought to us by one of our fellow listeners.
That is correct. One of you, who hopefully is listening to this episode, sent us a little voice message, and it goes a little something like this.
Matt and Noel, this is Weird West in Wyoming. I have a question. Have you guys ever thought that maybe Google is a tulpa? That it's found its own sentience, that it's there, that there's something to it. Also, look up the Tatum Salt Dome. See ya.
Okay, first thing here. Weird Wes, and we did not do this on purpose. Ben and I did not discuss this prior to recording this episode. You just asked if Google was a tulpa of some sort, some kind of thought form that had sentience that could act on its own. We did not, I don't know if Ben, if you listened to that voicemail right before this or something. I didn't do this on purpose. Now I'm thinking the tulpa that is Google is trying to bring us down from a YouTube standpoint, at least.
I'm fascinated by the idea. For anyone who is unfamiliar, a tulpa is this concept that a life form can exist without a physical body, a sentient thought or collection of thoughts or an algorithm. So, in a way, a software program that reaches the level of machine consciousness could be a tulpa. And, the aggregation of algorithms that are Google could in some ways be considered a tulpa. I've got a really weird story. I'll have to send you off air. I've been writing a bunch of garbage, but I've got a really weird story about a world in which emotions shared between two or more people can become sentient, and it's a tulpa situation. I started off trying to write it as a rom-com, but I'm terrible at rom-com, so it became yet another horror story. But you're right, Matt. It's a fascinating concept, and it's a concept that we have, I believe, explored in the past a little bit. But there was one thing you said, Weird Wes in Wyoming, that I think Matt and I really tuned into, because it was something that we had never heard of, which is admittedly, I don't want to say rare, but it's admittedly uncommon for us.
That is correct. That little thing, the little throwaway you had at the end of the message that just said, "Hey, look into the Tatum Salt Mines." Mm-hmm. Bye. Yeah, dude. But Ben and I both, and Noel actually, we all just went, "Wait, what is that?" And we started using Google, the tulpa. Now that we've established that, to search things about it, and my goodness, we found an entire episode hidden deep within those salt mines.
Mm-hmm. And I like the waxing poetic there at the end, Matt. It's true on multiple levels. Today's episode is inspired by you, Weird Wes in Wyoming. You contacted us about a strange, largely unknown event that occurred right here in the good old US of A. It's a bit of hidden history. It's a story the Jedi won't tell you. It concerns one of the most powerful, one of the most dangerous forces ever wielded by human hands, nuclear power. Here are the facts.
Before we jump into this, I just want to point out that, Ben, you and Noel got to do a bit of a nuclear story while I was out recently, and now Noel is out, and you and I get to do a nuclear story. And I'm liking this.
That's true. And they're very different as well. But disturbing.
Absolutely. So one of the major things here, as we begin into the facts, is just to talk about nuclear power within the United States. And, I would wager that there are several of you out there listening who remember the protesting that occurred within this country when nuclear power plants were beginning to be constructed across the states in various places that were deemed to be, good places for these things because they were safer there, But like a lot of the other protests that have occurred for various things in this country across time, they, appear to have done very little in actually preventing things from happening, and in this case, nuclear power plants from being built and or nuclear tests from being run. And a lot of this is because there are some tremendously beneficial things that can come from something like nuclear power that, isn't just your traditional burning of coal or other fossil fuels or natural gases or something like that. And these benefits many times, let's say almost all the time, are going to outweigh the dangers, at least if you're looking at it from a monetary standpoint, from a clean energy standpoint, or a cleanish energy standpoint. And, the dollar signs, really. That's what speaks to the most benefits.
Right. Yes. Make no mistake. The vast majority of large-scale actions that occur like this, especially in the energy industry, are the results of a cost-benefit calculation, the same way that we all individually use cost-benefit logic in our own daily lives. This just affects people in many, many unforeseen ways. So the protesters failed. Let's just be honest. The protesters failed. According to the World Nuclear Association, as of now, 2020, the United States is the world's largest producer of nuclear power. A single country out of the 193-ish countries in the world, it produces more than 30% of all of the nuclear generated electricity on the planet, full stop. And this is the result of a concerted effort that goes across both sides of the political divide in the U.S. Multiple companies are on board with it, even if they compete with each other. Government policy changes since about the late 1990s paved the way for a significant rise in nuclear capacity. And as of now, Uncle Sam officially has 98 nuclear power centers. They're across 30 states, and they're operated by a group of around 30, maybe more, different power companies.
And just like, Ben, you and Noel discovered when covering the Santa Susana experiment recently that occurred out in California, where some of this nuclear power was being generated and tested to see if there are new ways to generate the power, and something went wrong. We have to remember that these things, if something does go wrong, the consequences are massive, right? So that's when you're getting back into that cost benefit analysis. Nuclear power can be terrifying. We're going to look right here at words from an author, Benjamin K. Sovacool. He wrote A Critical Evaluation of Nuclear Power and Renewable Electricity in Asia. It was written in 2010. This guy says that there have been at least 56 nuclear reactor accidents within the United States. That seems like more than I've heard of, right? So, what he's saying is that there's a large scale here in what could be called a nuclear accident, right? Because the definition, it covers a wide range of things that could go wrong and that have go wrong. But there are some commonalities here with all 56 of these that Benjamin is pointing to.
Yeah, absolutely. These 56 accidents, again, that's a huge number, by the way. These 56 accidents all have two things in common. They either resulted in an immediate loss of human life, and immediate is important there, we'll see why, or they caused more than $50,000 US worth of property damage. That last part's very interesting to me because $50,000 is far more than the average US resident is going to have on hand, right? Just to pull out and use. But it's also a cartoonishly low threshold when we consider the overall cost of specialized nuclear equipment, particularly because that specialized equipment is inevitably going to be some of the first stuff damaged when things go south. And, again, you should be weirded out by that, how high that number is of proven nuclear incidents in the U.S., nuclear meltdowns, disasters, malfunctions. But there's one you're definitely familiar with. It's one that Noel and I mentioned in our previous episode, and that is 3 Mile Island. 3 Mile Island, for a quick recap, was a partial core meltdown at the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant on March 28th, 1979, and it's safe to say it exceeded that $50,000 threshold.
Yeah. The cleanup cost alone ranged somewhere within the $1 billion, like as in Dr. Evil $1 billion, and an estimated total of $2.4 billion in property damage that was done because as a result of this accident. And, over the years in various forms of reporting, you're going to hear all kinds of different claims about the health effects, both short-term and long-term, of this disaster. But officially, a lot of experts note that the health effects are of a very low level. Like, as in, not much bad really happened on a human level because of 3 Mile Island. Guys, we're going to reassure you, just to let you know, everything's okay. You're going to be okay. Your family's going to be fine.
Not everyone agrees, of course, because, even as recently as 1979, there was a lot of debate about the possible long-term ramifications of these sorts of disasters, or the possible long-term consequences to the life forms in their vicinity. Again, officially, right? This is all officially, and that's the problem with nuclear reporting in general, right? We threw out a couple numbers just a few minutes ago, but if you remember only one of those numbers, remember this one: 56 incidents. More than 50 times in this country, nuclear power almost or did go disastrously wrong. And even today, there's stuff the U.S. does not want you to know when it comes to nuclear power.
And there's certainly stuff they don't want you to know when it's turned from generating nuclear power to detonating nuclear weapons within the United States. What could go wrong if we did that?
We'll find out after a word from our sponsor. Here's where it gets crazy. So here's the issue with nuclear technology. One of the many issues. Nuclear technology is dual use. We've talked about this before. It's one of the great dilemmas in geopolitics. Please don't fall asleep just because we said geopolitics. Essentially, the same stuff you have to do to create nuclear power is the same stuff you have to do to make nuclear weapons. There are not very many efficient ways to tell the difference between a country's aim here, because there's not really a difference in what you need to do and what you need to have.
It's just how long you keep those centrifuges running.
Right.
That's really what it is. That's what it amounts to.
Right. It's a matter of iteration. That's really the only difference. Like, imagine if you were, this might be a little bit too off the grid for some of us, but imagine if you were churning butter, and after, X amount of churns or X amount of time spent churning, you had butter. But if you kept going, you had a bomb. That's basically the problem with nuclear energy and nuclear enrichment. And so this left the U.S. and many other countries in a pickle, because this meant that, in theory, any country with the ability to domestically create nuclear energy would also domestically have the ability to make nuclear weapons, and no one could stop them short of trusting them, or doing a Reagan trust but verify, watching how many times those centrifuges spin. It's a very messy situation. So they got into this idea of monitoring testing. Testing nuclear weapons is one great way to tell, right, what a country's true aims are. It's like building a battleship. You can't test a nuclear weapon and say you're doing anything other than that. You can't build a battleship and say you're doing anything other than attempting to build a Blue Force Navy and dominate part of the ocean. So the U.S. said, we need to figure out how these other countries are testing. And just for our own PR, we're going to say that we're doing this. Again, this is dual use. We're going to say we're doing this just to make sure we know what other countries are up to. It's defensive. Other countries, as widely suspected, were testing nuclear weapons underground so that you wouldn't, from a satellite, for instance, you wouldn't see a lot of atmospheric anomalies. You wouldn't have people on the ground noting, like a mushroom cloud miles away or something. So they said, okay, we're going to assume people are doing this underground because that's what we would do.
Well, exactly. And just to jump back in time slightly, we're talking about the 60s and 70s here, but let's just jump back in time to 1954 in March, and to something called Castle Bravo, and just the reason why the United States took on this. We're going to police the nuclear testing or possible nuclear testing across the globe, because we conducted a test in the United States in a place called the Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands. Like I said, in March 1st, 1954. It was a massive explosion. I believe it was 15 megatons. That was the yield, essentially. And there was a lot of fallout because of this nuclear test, like literally and I guess PR-ly, because it caused a lot of damage. And there was a lot of radiation that spread further and in ways that we perhaps didn't expect. And it was decided globally, at least between the powers of the United States and the Soviet Union and several other places, that we would no longer test nuclear weapons. Like, we were going to stop. That's why the U.S. took on this role.
Right. They said we're the perfect people to keep everyone honest here. 1954, also the same year that Edward Bernays helped persuade the U.S. to invade Guatemala and launch a coup on behalf of private agricultural sector businesses. It was a business coup. So shout out to you, Bernays, you monster. I'm still so impressed with the guy, though. You have to be. You got to respect the hustle. But anyhow, you're right. You're absolutely right, Matt. There's a lot of precedence going into this. But unfortunately, the U.S. was maybe not the best police officer. Maybe it was just the least worst. Like, that's what people say about democracy. It's the least worst system humans have come up with. But the U.S., like many other countries, blurred the line between testing for nuclear power, peaceful pursuits, and testing for nuclear weaponry. And that's why you'll notice that we caveated some of our earlier statements by adding the O word, officially. It's because we have to. You see, the U.S., aside from Bikini Atoll, it turns out the U.S. conducted multiple nuclear tests back in the day, some of which are still probably secret, but Weird West in Wyoming hipped us to several tests that occurred in good old Mississippi. And at the time, what's weird about this, these tests were not even secret. The New York Times ran an announcement about it that kind of aged like milk, because it's very like, whoa, hey, look at this. We're, nuclear power is not, what could go wrong? And you can read the article in full online, but this project, one of the first things I noticed about this project, Matt, was that it had just a terrible name.
You're talking about Project Dribble.
Yes.
I'm just drooling a little bit thinking about it. But yeah, this was one of several tests that fell under this thing called the Vela Uniform. This was a mission that was essentially attempting to detect nuclear blasts. It ran from 1963 to 1971, and it was the Vela mission really was to detect blasts that occurred in air, blasts that occurred on land, like above the ground, underwater, blasts that occurred even under the land, like in a cave or something. He was trying to figure out any of the ways that the United States forces, military in this case, could detect whether or not a nuclear blast had gone off anywhere in the world at any altitude.
Yeah, and this is similar to weather balloon detection programs, where we could maybe put something high enough in the atmosphere that it would detect certain changes indicative of a nuclear explosion. But figuring out what was going on under our feet was almost more important, because that's where the really sneaky stuff can occur. Vela Uniform was overall 7 different tests that we know about. And not all of those tests were nuclear, but not one, but 2 of the nuclear detonations occurred just north of a very small town in Lamar County, Mississippi, called Baxterville. Baxterville is tiny, 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 tiny. It's kind of like that. Around the time this occurred, Baxterville is what Garth Brooks would have called a one stoplight town or something like that. I'm forgetting my Garth Brooks, but you know what I'm referencing, right? Anyway, friends in low places aside, Baxterville was about 28 miles and is 28 miles southwest of Hattiesburg, which is probably the most recognizable town in the area. So the powers that be chose to detonate nuclear weapons in nearby Baxterville, where, again, people did live, because there was a distinctive geological feature there called the Tatum Salt Dome. Also, I have to mention, I don't know if it's because I was hungry when I was listening to your voicemail initially, Wes, but I could have sworn you said potato salt dome, and and I just started imagining all the cool things you can do with potatoes. But no, this is way less cool. This nuclear energy.
No joke, Ben. The first thing I Googled was potato salt dome. And I didn't know. I'm not joking. I thought that's what it was too. And that's nothing against US. I was maybe having a hard time understanding it when I was listening on my phone or something. And perhaps I was also a bit ravenous.
We're a very carb-oriented podcast in general. Just like as a crew,
For sure. I just want to go back. So we're talking about the Tatum Salt Dome. We're going to get into that. But I want to backtrack just for a moment to make sure people understand that these 7 tests that we're talking about with Vela Uniform were to test the sensor equipment that the Vela project essentially was going to use to detect explosions elsewhere. So in order to know that you can successfully detect an underground nuclear explosion, let's say somewhere in the USSR, you need to first manufacture your own explosion to see, hey, if they do one like this, can we see it? Yep. Okay. So that was the point of this. I am not sure if I explained that well enough prior to saying it here.
I think you nailed it. I think it's important to highlight that, because it's another instance of dual use, isn't it? It would be naive to assume that there would not be other data, right? Other results that were monitored and pulled from, again, these detonations of nuclear weapons. You're right. And they spent a lot of time thinking about this. As a matter of fact, they spent a lot of time thinking about how to set it up, but they did not spend a lot of time on 3 big things. And that's what this episode is about. First, they obviously didn't spend a lot of time thinking through what would actually happen when you detonated nuclear, they call it a nuclear device, but when you detonate a nuclear bomb underground in an occupied area. Second, they didn't think about the long-term consequences, aftermath, or effects. And third, they really phoned in the names. I can't emphasize that enough. Project Dribble. The first test is called the Salmon Event, which sounds like something your local park ranger gets excited about once a year. You know what I mean?
Yeah, Yeah, I think they were hungry too, man.
Maybe they were.
Well, we mentioned the Tatum Salt Dome, why it's important. I just could put this out here quickly. One of the major reasons when they're imagining what another country might do when they were going to try and test underground, they thought, well, if there was some kind of salt dome or an underground salt deposit, essentially, somewhere on land, the authorities could put a bunch of water into that salt deposit, essentially, turn that solid sodium into salt water and create a cavity underground where they could then place a bomb, explode it, and do some testing, right? That was one of the major reasons they chose this Tatum Salt Mine or Tatum Salt Dome.
Right. Yeah. It wasn't just because it was cool, but it was because of the actual physical makeup of the dome. So they announced this to their credit, unlike some other U.S. tests on domestic populations. And here's what they decided to do. On October 22nd, after warning some residents in the area, about 10 a.m., 1964, the authorities detonated a 5.3 kiloton device 820 meters, or 2,700 feet, underground. Real quick, because I know we've thrown some words around here, kiloton is 1,000 tons. So this is like 5,000 tons and change. A megaton, like Matt, you had mentioned with Bikini Atoll, is 1 million tons. So this is smaller than Bikini Atoll, but again, it is in it's in an area where people were not expecting to encounter radiation and nuclear disaster. So the first thing that goes wrong when they detonate this at 10 a.m. is that the explosion is much, much stronger than the residents had been told it would be. The ground shook. A gigantic cloud of dust rises, the thing they were hoping to avoid. Windows break, walls crack 14 miles away, wells go bad, run dry, they clog. This favorite story, I know you probably have some too, Matt. One of my favorite stories is there's a local fisherman who watches in amazement as all the fish in this pond jump out of the water at once.
Wow. Yeah, I can't imagine seeing that. Wow. Well, another thing that I can't imagine is the way a lot of the local residents described what they saw, even when they were miles away from ground zero. I'm just going to paraphrase this, and you can go online and read a lot of firsthand accounts of this test, salmon in particular. They noted that there were ground ripples, like waves of the ground, where it's estimates now at this point, because a lot of this was looking back, 20, 30, 40, 50 years after the incident. But a lot of it they described as, maybe 3 feet of ground, let's say. Now imagine 5 inches of wave of that ground that you can see moving, essentially in a semicircular path towards you, and actually moving the ground and rippling it. There were some people who said they were standing on concrete, and on the concrete, you could feel a wave of earth travel under your feet. And then they described about 10 to 15 seconds of just quiet and nothing, and then another ripple, and then another 11 seconds or so, and then a third ripple of the ground that you could actually watch. Like, that sounds otherworldly to me.
Mm-hmm. Have you ever, I don't remember if we talked about this, Matt, have you ever been in an earthquake or experienced one?
There have been several very, very low level earthquakes in Georgia that I have felt. And I didn't know I was feeling it until I woke up the next day and read that there was a low level earthquake. Mm-hmm. But I've been to California a few times now in my life, and I've never experienced anything big or in any other place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an incredibly disorienting feeling, and it's one of those things where all of a sudden you recognize how powerless we as individuals can be. When I was living in Central America, I looked like a wuss the first couple of times, You know, I was at this family's this family's residence where, you know, we're drinking instant coffee. It's like 8:30 in the morning or something. And then all of a sudden the kitchen just moves and then it moves back. And some stuff, I'm trying not to curse here, but some stuff just falls off the shelves. And the lady whose house it was, she's like, I'm just going to put up this spoon again and blah, blah, blah. And I think maybe I've done some sort of drug that I can't remember, you know, and that reality is just glitching. But I say that because, you know, it is difficult to explain what an earthquake feels like unless you experience it. There is no anchor. There is nothing that you can hold because the world is quaking. And this is what these people experience, right? So, of course, they're scared, especially because they thought they had done everything right. They had complied with the orders of the federal government. They had evacuated if they were told to evacuate. And they still, as we would say today, got their stuff rocked, you know? And the thing is that, okay, this is crazy, right? No one dies immediately. And thank your lucky stars for that, right? Federal agents, residents alike. Several weeks after the blast, the government has hired workers to drill back into the hole in the ground left by this explosion.
In the Tatum Salt Dome.
In the Tatum Salt Dome to release radioactive gas that's trapped inside. Now, the officials were using what we would describe as cutting-edge technology for the time. They had scrubbers that were set up, and a scrubber basically would decontaminate the radioactive gas. But soon they realized that wasn't the real problem. They would have to do something about the radioactive liquid waste from all the drilling operations. Just like in Lord of the Rings, they delved too deep, and their Balrog was very dangerous waste radiation. So they said, okay, you know what we're going to do? We're going to dig a hole. We're going to dig some more holes, and we're going to dig one really deep hole, 2,400 feet into the earth right by the Salt Dome. And then someone in the room is like, hey, isn't there a groundwater aquifer there? And they're like, come, Craig, I need you to be a team player.
It's fine. It's also, who cares if it's an aquifer? Everything will be fine. There's no problem with irradiating groundwater. Yeah. So we're still in 1965 here, remember, and between March and July of that year, there was a ton of radioactive liquid waste that was disposed of into this well where an underground aquifer was. We're talking about 338,000 gallons of radioactive waste that was just, see you later, down into the well, into the water. And that wasn't it either. That's not where the story stops. It wasn't just one nuclear test underground at this location. The government went right back through and dropped another bomb into that hole that they created with the first test. And we'll tell you all about that when we return from a word from our sponsor.
That's right. They must have had a different person writing the names by this point. A few years later, they conduct a second test, as you said, Matt, during what was called the Sterling event. This happened on December 3rd, 1966. Basically, they said, hey, we got this great hole from earlier. Let's keep using it. This was a very pro hole in the ground kind of institution. And it made sense. I don't mean to bust their chops too hard. It made sense. So they dropped a 380-ton device into the cavity that was left behind by the previous explosion in the Salmon event. The Department of Defense and associated agencies required residents for these tests within 1.5 miles of the explosion point to leave their homes while the events were occurring. They also said, hey, these detonations might mess up your house a little bit. They might damage some buildings and stuff.
And it did.
And it definitely did. They also proactively said, we're going to get in front of this, as they say in corporate America or in the realm of politics, and we're going to go ahead and just let you know, whatever happens, we're going to give you $5,000. Just tell us what happened. We'll give you $5,000. Everybody's happy. It didn't stop there. Later, they would go on to conduct more experiments with non-nuclear explosives during a project called Miracle Play, which sounds like something for, your Nintendo Switch.
Yeah. Yeah, it does. Ben, really quickly, let's get into the reason why they tested a secondary, much, much smaller device in that same place where they caused the first explosion. Just quickly, just go over this. So the first time they detonated a nuke in the Tatum Salt Dome, it essentially created a massive, let's say, spherical hole in the ground. Not necessarily a hole that you can get into, like a cavern, like a cave, basically, underneath the ground. And once they had created that with the first explosion, the first test during Salmon, they, like we said, they drilled a hole into this cavity. They dropped a much smaller bomb, and what did we say it was? 380 ton. Yeah, 380 ton device, much smaller, and they dropped that down there, and it exploded to test whether or not there would be this dampening effect that the scientists and personnel that were testing with the Vela uniform, they wanted to see if a country could do that, could dampen the essentially shockwaves of a nuclear explosion by having a hole in the ground, a large cavernous hole in the ground, rather than just dipping it into the ground and exploding it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there is valuable science here. You know what I mean? I think that's one of the biggest points about this. But the problem is, everything we've described, even with the safety measures that they took, it's still incredibly dangerous. People were living in the area, right? And you'll be happy / roll your eyes and groaning to learn that Uncle Sam did compensate the residents of Baxterville and Hattiesburg even. They gave adults $10 and they gave children $5. The shockwave of this explosion literally lifted the ground 4 inches. A lot of buildings only had minimal damage. That's frankly amazing. But what is not amazing, and what is, perhaps the most disappointing and strange part of this story, be the effects and the aftermath, which they clearly did not plan for.
Agreed. I would say we're talking $1964, so $10, $5, not too shabby.
That's very fair of you. Yes.
I'm being facetious here. No, you're right, though, Ben. The aftermath and effects of these tests is not something to laugh at. I apologize. Again, we're in one of those situations where you're trying to be a little light just because this stuff is, it's tough on individual people and families. So, the big thing here is that the United States government appears to not have been fully aware of the risks that were posed by contaminating with radiation things like groundwater and just a general area where flora and fauna are going to be affected by this radiation. They were, however, fully aware of the horrific consequences of dropping the bomb on, let's say, a city and suburban area. When you're looking at the attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in this case, the logic at least was that this would not have much of an effect because you're exploding this thing underground, because the radioactive material is going to be stuck under there. It's not going to be able to escape and get into the air and affect things in the way that we generally had been testing nukes in the past. And it would, over time, if you didn't disturb the area, and especially like essentially the cave that was created because of this explosion, if you didn't disturb that, then the stuff would decay naturally, slowly, but naturally, and you wouldn't have to worry too much.
Right. This was not the case. Follow-up drilling operations that allowed scientists to collect more information about this and to dispose of the devices actually ended up contaminating the site. So it wasn't so much the initial testing as it was the later attempts to leverage info from the testing or to get a hold of these devices created hazardous radioactive waste. All like imagine that green gunk you see in episodes of The Simpsons or Captain Planet. It made that stuff, and that stuff is very, very bad. Humans are not built to be around it. Decades after the first test, the Department of Energy is still picking up radiation in the ground and, surprise, in the aquifers, and that is due to the problem with the cleanup. Employees who worked on these cleanup missions said that it was lax at best. A couple of employees in particular, maintained that they were lied to when they asked medical professionals to explain things like strange burns they found or differing medical conditions. The Department of Energy maintained that the radiation levels they did find, even the ones that persisted for decades, were no threat to the health of residents. And to be fair, we know that the modern human being, especially in the West, is exposed to low levels of radiation from including everything from like maybe an X-ray scan to, I kid you not, bananas. Bananas have low-level radiation. So they were saying...
And flying in a plane. Woohoo!
Oh, yeah, and flying in a plane. Oh, man. Remember when we used to do that? I would still trade it all. I was supposed to go to Easter Island this summer. Did I tell you that?
No.
It was a secret plan. I didn't want to tell you guys until I could text you a picture. But
Dang.
Yeah, but being a U.S. resident traveling internationally is going to be hairy for a while. Even if you live in the U.S. and you have the ability to go somewhere, the other country might not necessarily want to let you in now more than ever. But we'll see. Anyway, that doesn't matter. The point that matters here is that there are a lot of things that expose you to low-level radiation. You run into it all the time. And the Department of Energy was saying, well, this is kind of the same thing. It's not going to be dangerous. But in the 1990s, residents of the area, Baxterville, Hattiesburg, and workers from Project Dribble, they started to say, a lot of our friends, coworkers, and loved ones from this time period are dying, and they're dying of cancer.
Yeah. About 25, 30 years later, that's when I guess you begin to notice that radiation, those rads you took back in the day are starting to show themselves because there are long-term effects there. And, the local residents ended up creating a list of, I believe it was 44 people who had either died of cancer or who had developed cancer. And, that's in the large scheme of things, that's a relatively low number. But in a small town, 44 people in an immediate area who had, gotten cancer or died of cancer is a lot. And they demanded that the state and federal government figure out if any of these conditions were in any way linked to the Salt Dome tests that were done back in the 60s. And, we're talking 1990s. It moved slowly, trying to get any kind of movement within the legal system, within, the people who could actually run the testing. Because there was, by the way, there was a lot of long-term testing of the flora and fauna in the immediate area that was going on. But, I couldn't find much on the actual testing of the residents that was going on up until they started raising a flag and saying, hey, we're fauna too.
Right. That's a very, very salient point.
By the way, forgot to mention this. A lot of residents in this area used wells that they had, dug or had been there existing on their properties prior to these events, almost all, if not every one of the wells in the surrounding area were producing undrinkable water, or no water at all, water that was not potable for them to drink. So they had to find alternative means to get water. There, you can read a lot more about this in a couple of places online. I would recommend the Atomic Heritage site, atomicheritage.org. And there's also a bunch of local reporting that's happened over the let's say from about 2010 and onward. There have been several stories about this. Sorry, just want to put that out there.
Oh, yeah. I would recommend, I was reading into work by NOLA.com, by the Sun Herald. There's a really good Atlas Obscura article on this that gives a nice overview. But you're right, without admitting liability for some stuff, around 2000, the government built a water pipeline to help residents of the Tatum Salt Dome get drinking water that came from an area other than the test site. And their idea was, we're not officially saying that we really screwed the pooch on this, but we want you guys to feel better. So this is for you. Fast forward 2015, the Department of Labor has paid nearly $5.5 million US to people who are suffering medical problems after working at the Salmon nuclear explosion site, again, southwest of Hattiesburg, about 28 miles. So if you combine that with the money that was paid to workers who lived in Mississippi but didn't necessarily work on the site, the total bill is $16.8 million. Oddly enough, that's the price tag for a total of 56 claims. Odd coincidence. There's that number again for the numerologist in the crowd. Those 56 claims came from the Salmon site, which today we usually call the Tatum Salt Dome. And today, as we record this, officially, Tatum Salt Dome is the location of the only known nuclear weapons test, aka detonation, to ever be performed in the eastern United States.
That's right. A lot of it was done out in Nevada, however you want to say it, at the test sites out there and a couple of other places, or just, outside of the United States on atolls and other places underneath the water and in the air in various places. It's pretty weird to think about, and it's so odd, again, that Ben and I were unaware of this until Weird West came along and was like, hey, guys, look at this, and then left. It's really frustrating to know that the government did pay out that money to 56 people when, to my mind, you think about the residents that have been living there, or the families that have been growing up there near this place. It feels like there's been a larger effect maybe than just the workers who were there on site who got dosed with radiation, because, it's highly likely that they did, and that's probably one of the major reasons that the money was actually paid out. But just thinking about the number of people that ended up drinking water, and children that ended up drinking water around there, it feels like there would be more casualties, but maybe I'm wrong. I would say there are a couple places online where you can read firsthand accounts of people who were there. And there's one gentleman who refers a couple of times to the number of people with cancer. And he says, I believe the quote is something along the lines of, if you look north, essentially, of the Tatum Salt Dome, that's where there are a ton of people getting cancer. And that was I believe it was a 2014 interview with this gentleman. But he was specifically saying, look to the north of where these explosions occurred, and that's where you'll find the people who were really affected.
And this situation has not been solved, more than decades and decades later. This situation remains unsolved. The one important thing to note here is we are harping a lot on the activities of the U.S. government, but make no mistake, the USSR was conducting similarly dangerous and devious nuclear experiments, and many other modern nuclear powers have done the same thing. This was how the radioactive sausage was made. Today, most of the residents of Lamar County have, maybe a passing understanding of these two nuclear explosions, right? At least from what we understand. And younger citizens in Mississippi, typically, like if you drove there today and you asked someone, say, I don't know, under 18 about this stuff, they probably haven't heard of Project Dribble. To your point, Matt, about the distribution of cancer and cancer rates, statistics now show that cancer and heart disease, the rates in Baxterville, are comparable to the rest of the state of Mississippi, which sadly means that they are noticeably higher than the national average. Some residents who are familiar with this story maintain that the U.S. government is still hiding some part of the truth, whether that's the full extent of the radiation, the consequences of the test, or the distribution of contamination-associated medical conditions. I don't know, you can't blame people for being distrustful in these situations in general. But thank you to Weird West Wyoming. Wish we had more of a happy ending to this story, but the best thing we can say is the story's not over yet.
That's right. The story's not over. Thank you, Wes. I will give you just a quick thing from the Sun Herald. So back about 10 years ago, a little less than 10 years ago, back in 2010, the good old US of A government declared that this site, the Tatum Salt Dome in this area, was safe, and they transferred, I believe it was about 1,500 acres to the state, back to Mississippi. And they were talking about how, the wood out here, the trees, the timber, this is all really good stuff we can use. It's about $2 million worth of $2010 of this stuff. And also, we could build recreational sites here. Let's do it. Hey, we got all this land. Let's make it happen. Everything's safe. And the state health department in Mississippi in 2013, they were still, up until 2013, they were still monitoring the whole site, looking at the water specifically for tritium, which is, according to the Sun Herald, which is also, according to science, a radioactive isotope of hydrogen. And, they were saying, you know what, we're okay. We're still going to monitor the groundwater. We're going to look at the surface water, but everything seems fine. Let's get back to it out here in the old Tatum Salt Dome. Here's another thing, just a quick note that they make at the end of this article, which, by the way, is called Nuclear Tests in South Mississippi Cost Government Millions in Claims. They note that several times the concept of using a salt mine or a salt dome in this way as a safe place to store nuclear waste, even though we learned from this test that it's not necessarily a safe place to store nuclear waste because of the aquifers. That is, I think, one of the big takeaways. Nuclear waste and ground aquifers it's a very dangerous combination.
Yeah, it's true. And at this point, we pass the torch to you. What do you think about this? Do you think that people are maybe being alarmist about the connection between these older nuclear detonations and rates of cancer or certain medical conditions in the area now? Do you think that there's not enough attention put on this? What do you think about other similar tests in the world, and are there any that you are aware of in your neck of the global woods? We'd love to hear from you. Let us know. You can find us on the internet. We're all over it. The internet is just like lousy with our presence, despite the fact that we have seemingly angered the tulpa god of internet search. You can find us on Facebook. You can find us on Twitter. You can find us on Instagram. We especially like to recommend our Facebook community page. Here's where it gets crazy.
Yes, you can hang out there with your fellow conspiracy realists, talk about this episode, suggest others, post memes, whatever you want to do. You can hang out with some of the awesomest mods that exist on that old Facebook platform. If you don't want to do that stuff, you can always pick up your phone and give us a call. Our number is 1-833-STDWYTK. If you leave a message, you can be certain that Ben and I will both hear it, and Noel will hear of it if we deem it to be good enough for him to listen to. No, I'm just joking. Noel's going to listen to. If you don't want to do that stuff, but you still want to reach out, you can always reach us at our good old-fashioned email. We are
conspiracy@iHeartRadio.com.
Stuff They Don't Want You to Know is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.